Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. Hey, y'all. It occurs to me that many of you may be getting the COVID-19 vaccine, and I've had the first dose. Um, I'm getting my second in like a week, and the first dose was manageable. I had some pretty bad neck stiffness that was a little scary, but it didn't occur to me until after the fact that that might have been related. But if you're an individual who's getting the vaccine, good on you. If you've yet to get it or you haven't considered it, I would encourage you to do that. Although in California and New York, long lines, it's hard to get the appointments. Unfortunately, um, in some states, people aren't actually taking appointments and appointments are going unfilled. So life is hard. But if you can get a vaccine, I would encourage you to do that. That would be very good, and you would be an example of a good citizen. This is our topic today, citizen, and we're going to talk about what kind of an institution a citizen is. So far in the class, you know that we've talked mainly about formal institutions, the rules of the game, and we've talked a lot about how changing the rules can change the incentives faced by the players and how the players might behave differently under different rules of the game. But so far, we've actually talked less about the players themselves. And that's unfortunate because citizen is really an important word in democratic discourse. And in fact, most constitutions include the word citizen very, very frequently. In fact, I went out and took a look at some different constitutions just to see if I could get a feel on the frequency of the term and the way that it's used in different circumstances. And just in the Americas alone, I found a limitless number of examples. So, for instance, in the Venezuelan constitution, in Article 62, it says that all citizens have the right to participate freely. In the Brazilian constitution, in Article 1, it says all power emanates from the people. In the Brazilian Constitution, Article 14, it says the sovereignty of the people shall be exercised. And then in the US Constitution, Amendment 1, it says effectively Congress cannot restrict citizens' right to peacefully assemble. And so everywhere you look, this term citizen seems to appear and be used in conjunction with key democratic institutions. And it occurs to me that citizen itself is an institution, and that the idea or the notion or the thing citizen we've constructed in such a way that it performs an important function in a democracy. It seems to have an important role in our discourse in the way that we understand democracy. These examples from the Americas show that in detail, and you could find many, many other examples from these constitutions and many others. And I think that the best place for us to start as we begin to discuss this question of what is a citizen and what is the role of a citizen in a democracy is, what does it mean to be a citizen? When we say, I am a citizen, what do we mean when we say that? And then relatedly, what is the role of a citizen in a democracy, or how does citizen relate to democracy? This is about the broadest way that we could possibly begin, but I would love to hear from you and get things started with a little bit of discussion. Does anyone want to talk about what it means to be a citizen? So what does it mean to be a citizen?
Um, I think there are multiple parts to being a citizen. Um, according to like social contract theory, you basically set up a like contract with the government saying like I agree to being a law-abiding citizen for the protection of my rights and also giving power to the government um in case they were to misuse it. So I guess you could say you kind of engage with the government in a social contract, for the protection of your rights. You give the government or a representative within the government power to make decisions within the government for the betterment of society as a whole.
So there's a lot there, but the most important part, I think, Kyrie, is it's like a relationship, right? It's sort of like a deal or like this agreement or this contract, or it like implies this sort of transaction. At a bare minimum, it's relational. You are a citizen, a member of something bigger, right? You are a citizen of a community or a member of some group where there is authority that resides in someone's hands, and they use that authority to make decisions that affect everyone in your community. And you're involved in this sort of relationship. That's a very good start, right? It implies that when we are a citizen, we're a citizen of something, right? We're a part of something. And there's something else going on and something else around us that we're a part of. Okay, good. Jeffrey, you had your hand up. Do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I would say that a citizen is someone by birthright or someone that immigrated to a particular state that basically was granted citizenship. That person is basically given, or I would say that that a person by birthright is basically granted and responsibilities as that member of that nation or of that state.
So, Jeffrey, is it safe to say that if there was no state, there could be no such concept as citizenship?
Yeah, I would say that because it's kind of impossible to basically have citizenship if there's basically no state, or yeah, basically no state that's basically implemented.
I see. So the existence of institutions has to let me start over. Certain institutions have to exist before we can have the concept of a citizen. Okay, good. Good.
I would say that.
Okay. Okay. Excellent. So what that means then is we're already dealing with questions of power, right? And we're already dealing with questions of conferral and whether or not some status is or is not conferred upon someone. And the thing that confers that status upon them is the state. It's the government, right? The central authority, the one that is itself an institution, something that we've already created and empowered to make these decisions. Interesting. Interesting. Very good start. So I want to go ahead and begin to incorporate some of the commentary in the chat, and I want to pose some questions to you as we get started with this new topic. Eduardo says, at the very minimum, it means to have the right to vote. So Eduardo points out that in keeping with the idea that some pre-existing institution confers some status upon you, there's also some set of rights or privileges that are conferred upon you potentially as part of that status that you're given, right? As part of that status that the state gives you by virtue of you being a certain thing in that community or that larger that larger group. Efren says, I think being a citizen is being given the right to express concerns and participate without any consequences. Okay. Okay, so consistent again with the rights and the privileges that you may obtain by virtue of being granted some status by the central authority or by the state. Uriel says, as someone who became a citizen not long ago, to me, it means to be able to participate in the direction that the country moves forwards by voting and having the rights and liberties that the country guarantees to me as a citizen, while also abiding to the rules set by the country. So for Uriel, who recently became a citizen, it's about having certain rights, but then also about having certain liberties or certain protections, as long as you adhere to the rules of that country. And probably also even if you break the rules, frankly, right? So to a certain extent, felons or those in prison still enjoy all the rights that we do. For instance, they in most places do still get to vote. They still received the stimulus during the COVID bill. Many of those rights still go to them, and they still enjoy many of those protections. But that general idea that those rights are enjoyed by virtue of being a citizen or receiving that status suggests that there's this important institutional outcome, right? There's this expectation that members of the community will enjoy certain privileges or rights that have been conferred upon them as members of that community. Santiago says a participatory member of a community. Now, Santiago, does that mean that you have to participate? Does being a citizen mean you participate or that you have the right to participate? Anyone who wants to address that question, I'd like to hear from. Does being a citizen mean simply having the right to do something, or does it mean having and exercising that right? Jake says you have the right to participate. So it sounds like to me, Jake suggests that you have the right, but you don't necessarily have to, right? So maybe part of the right is being free to do so or to not do so. Being able to have the right, says Sasha. Oscar says, I think you have the right to participate rather than just participate. Okay, good. Okay. So maybe being a citizen, in addition to having some status conferred upon you, there's like this set of choices or options that is available to you, none of which you must choose, but which you may choose based upon your preference or whatever you like. Jocelyn says, I feel that at a minimum, it means that you're technically taken into consideration in these laws and protections if you abide by the rule, because you aren't a citizen, things don't pertain to you necessarily. Justin says, I think citizens have the right to participate, but not necessarily you must exercise. Good, good. So do you see then that there are some important questions that arise when we think about what a citizen is, first of all, what it means to be a citizen, and then whether that responsibility of a citizen requires that they do certain things or requires that they at least exercise some choice and choose what to do, even if it means that they don't take some certain course of action. Tyler says, would paying taxes be a form of forced participation? Well, I think that there's an important role for the idea of a social contract. Remember that, well, I think it was Jeffrey who said at the beginning that a social contract implies that the state provides you protection and security in exchange for you paying taxes and obeying certain rules of the state. I think that many would argue that paying taxes falls under the principle of the social contract. Now, many would say that taxation is theft. I think it's sort of a meaningless comment. It certainly is an example of the use of the coercive power of the state to collect from the population, but we also benefit from the security and the protection extended to us by the state. So I think that the social contract is relevant to this, but as you're all noticing, inevitably, citizenship is sort of dicey. What does it mean exactly? Well, we know at a bare minimum, it means that there's some central authority or some state or some pre-existing institution that confers some status upon us. We are members of that state or that community. But what does it mean to be a member? Does it mean that we have certain rights and privileges that we can choose to exercise, but we need not exercise? Or does it mean that we have a responsibility to perform certain functions? And if we have a responsibility to perform those functions, do they remain rights and privileges, or do they then become requirements or mandates? You see, the concept of a citizen is quite complicated because it's a part of democracy and it implies that we have certain rights and privileges, but it also obviously implies certain responsibilities, certain things that we might need to do, or certain things that might be incumbent upon us as members of the community. Now, so we're going to deal with all this today and then on Friday as well. And as we unfurl this concept, and what I want to establish and argue to you is that our concept of citizen is actually more sort of categorical in the sense that it's kind of hollow. There isn't substance to it. A citizen is what we confer upon it in that political system at that moment in time, right? So at our contemporary moment, a democratic citizen has certain rights and potential responsibilities. But as I'll show you in a moment, before the age of revolution, in the early modern period, especially, democracy was viewed with suspicion and citizens were viewed with suspicion because the right to vote and the exercise of one's vote or the participation of ordinary people in decision making was viewed as an inherently negative thing because of the potential for the common people to subvert the interest of elites in the larger community. The point is, the notion of citizen is always historical, and our understanding of democracy is always sort of historical as well. And so it'll make more sense then on Friday when we talk about how deliberative democracy and participatory democracy in Latin America is very much a product of the contemporary period, and how those forms of democracy demand more of the citizen and conceptualize the citizen very differently than the forms of rule that typified the earlier periods of early modern era. And we'll talk about those differences as we go along. Justin says, I think another idea is that while we have the right and not necessarily we must exercise, we are encouraged to do so. Just like voting, citizens have the right to vote. We don't have to vote, but are encouraged to do so to contribute to the society. Touche, sort of like a fine line between requirement and choice, right? And the question of compulsory voting and how consistent compulsory voting is with democracy more broadly is a relevant question. Some of you have said in the past in this class that compulsory voting seems inconsistent with democracy because the choice of whether or not to vote is a choice. And so to require it seems different. But we can address these questions as we go along. This larger lecture is going to focus on these four components that we'll deal with piece by piece. First, we're going to conceptualize citizen and talk about what a conceptualization of citizen would need to attend to, what the different dimensions of such a conceptualization are, and how the concept of citizen has varied correspondingly throughout history as the political circumstances and the contextual and historical circumstances have changed. We'll do all of this in service of eventually sizing up what we call deliberative democracy, which is a form of democracy that is more participatory in that involves creating additional channels of participation, often at a local level, so that citizens can participate in things like budgetary decision making, how to allocate money, tax revenue, what to prioritize at a local level when investing scarce or limited resources, We'll talk a lot about Latin America, where in Brazilian cities in particular, citizens have been experimenting with deliberative and participatory forms of democracy, where the concept of the citizen is much more expansive and where the responsibilities of the citizen are arguably more expansive and more extended. And then finally, on Friday, at the end, I'm going to create some simulations and some scenarios where you will be invited to make decisions in response to different circumstances or information or contexts that I put you in. And the goal will be to learn these institutional arrangements and learn about some of the options and the choices that become available to you as a citizen under these different arrangements. And so, as always, this is a class where we talk about the institutions, but where we also talk about the history and the evolution and the differences across time and space and across types. So get ready for it. As always, I want to encourage you to be very, very engaged. And I want you to think about the changes across time and especially how the contemporary period presents us with all new types of democracy, including the participatory and the deliberative forms that we've already read about for this week. Now, give me just a moment. I got to close the door. So, when I ask you the question, what does it mean to be a citizen? It's sort of a misleading question because the truth is, what it means to be a citizen depends on the time and the place and the form of rule and the type of democracy or the type of political system. Really, citizen is most intimately associated with the concept of democracy. You become a citizen in a democratic context, a circumstance where you have the freedom or the right to choose or participate or make decisions free of coercion or constraint. But generally speaking, we can still distinguish between different conceptions of citizen based upon different types of democracy or the different time periods that might come into consideration. Any conception of a citizen or of citizen needs to begin with a specification of the rights that belong to the citizens. And so what rights fall under contemporary democracy that we would extend to citizens? What rights would not fall under that contemporary democratic heading? We could make a long list of all the rights that we would associate with our conception of democracy, but it might differ radically from the list that our successors or generations after us would make, or from the lists that people hundreds of years before us would make. The point is that it can always vary and it can always depend on the circumstances. And so too can the ideals and the virtues and the responsibilities that we think that citizens should develop. It could be that some of you argue that citizens must vote. But some of you might also argue that citizens must only consider whether they want to vote, and they may or may not vote. Now, what's interesting is considering what would happen if none of us voted. Could democracy function if no citizen voted? Good question. But we at least agree that democracy seems to suggest that there's choice or freedom involved. The citizen's role is always going to be to serve the functioning of the polity in some way. It's essentially instrumental. So it basically assumes the existence of the state. Like I said earlier, when I said to Jeffrey, so Jeffrey, would you agree then that the concept of citizen assumes the existence of the state? Jeffrey said yes. It does assume the pre-existence of some state or some community, some political system that has the capacity to confer upon potential members the status of citizen. The citizen's role is always to serve the functioning of that system. But what specific duties promote that system, it depends on us. It depends on what we decide on this day in history at this moment in time. And it happens to be the case that increasingly we conceive of citizenship in deliberative and participatory ways. We think about citizenship in terms of the right or the privilege or the potential responsibility of citizens to participate in budgetary decision making, in decisions about how to invest and allocate resources, decisions that we might previously have left to administrators or city council members or others to whom we delegated authority. The point that I want to make to you is that as our conception of democracy has changed and evolved, the duties that we expect the citizen to promote and fulfill have also evolved. And so let's examine the concept of citizen in historical perspective. And I want to show you how the concept of citizen has evolved and how radically different it used to be compared to how it is today. You might be surprised that relatively recently, we still conceived of the citizen in a very, very negative way. Jeffrey, you have a comment?
Well, I had a question because I was recognizing that the word citizen, because I was looking back at the origins, with the Greeks and what they were basically trying to see. And so if the Greek word for citizen is polity, and the Greek word for politics is politiki, like, is there like a similar, is there like an, which, and that word politiki means, the affairs of the state. So does that mean that, like, is there like a connection between the two, a polity and then the affairs of the state, which is like citizens are involved with the affairs of the state? Or is that like a reach that I'm just making?
No, I think that's the connection that you made earlier, which is that the very concept of citizen presumes the existence of the state. Before the state existed, before these political systems existed, we didn't have a concept of citizen. So I don't think it's a reach at all. We need the concept of the state to understand the notion or the idea of citizen, because citizen is a member of the state, right? So it doesn't make any sense to think about citizen in the absence of that organized context. But this is why the concept is also loaded with a lot of tension too, because if citizen exists to serve the functioning of the state, can there be such a thing as a democratic citizen? Because democracy is about choice, and you may choose not to serve some function, but does the democratic state still function if you choose not to participate? My point that I want to establish to you is that we always have to understand the coercive power of the state as intimately connected to the status of the citizen. But that very relationship also provokes a lot of curiosity and wonder, because that's also sort of a contradiction in terms to sort of hold those things simultaneously: authoritarianism, coercive power, citizen, and democracy. Those are two things that are kind of in tension with one another. But let's look at the evolution of the concept of citizen in historical perspective. And I want to show you how this has evolved and how the meaning of citizen has emerged in a way that was intimately tied to the development of democracy and the modern form of democracy. So today, at our present time, it's relatively well accepted, the idea that democracy is desirable and something that we want to have. It's good for its sake, but we haven't always agreed that democracy is desirable and something that we want for its sake. Actually, until the mid 1800s, democracy was actually seen as very dangerous and very antiquated. And in particular, citizens were viewed with suspicion. People like you and I people who were not elites and who were not of a noble or baronial class were viewed as inherently detrimental to the state. And citizens were viewed as common people and people who should be viewed with skepticism and suspicion. These were people who didn't have economic independence. They were peasants who, by definition, relied on a noble or a baron who would provide them land that they could farm on in exchange for that peasant providing them free labor on the farms held by the noble or the baron. And these common, ordinary people, they had no economic freedom, they had no education, they had no knowledge. Demos literally meant common people. And so citizen, the way that we understand it today as an ordinary person, had a very negative connotation. These people were viewed as a threat. They were viewed as inherently bad. And the fear was that they were so deranged and so common and so dependent and so uneducated and so dumb that they would pursue their own interests. And they would do so at the expense of the larger community. But really, the larger community meant, elite interests, right? The baronial and the noble class, the ones who mainly controlled the society and who had the most to lose. So from the start, citizen didn't have a good connotation. Citizen was an ordinary person, not the person who was part of the elite, who controlled society. Citizen was something else. And from the start, then, we had a long way to go. If you're like me and you're not an elite or a person of noble birth or privileged status. Plato was especially skeptical of the poor, and he said that democracy is the poor against the rich. He said that this is a poor underclass waging political war on the rich, educated, noble elite who are so stately, who are so above the common folk, the common citizens. Aristotle disagreed, but only partly. He said that sometimes, only sometimes, the poors can make decisions that are good for everyone. But even Aristotle said that it depends. It depends on the precise form that citizen rule or rule by common people takes. And to that effect, Aristotle made a typology of different forms of rule. Citizens, as common people or ordinary people, were differentiated from elites or aristocrats. And again, I make that distinction between people like you and I, and then the people on high who control society and control land and control powerful institutions. But Aristotle, even though he was more favorable to the poor than Plato, still didn't view them as generally good. It depended on the precise type of rule and the ways that the citizens took control of the polity. So Aristotle developed a typology, and the idea was that citizen rule was only one form of rule, and that the different forms of rule could be distinguished based on the number of rulers and then whether or not the quality of that rule was sociotropic and community looking, good that is, or corrupt and inward looking based on the personal and the interests of the rulers themselves. And Aristotle said that both elites and citizens are potentially subject to corrupt behavior. But the difference is that democracy only obtains when many people exercise the power to rule. Democracy is the form that obtains when corrupt masses rule and disperse power among themselves. And so even though Aristotle was willing to acknowledge that ordinary citizens could rule in a good way, in which case it would be called polity, the corrupt form of that would be called democracy. Basically, Aristotle said that you can have a system where there's one ruler. The good form of that would be monarchy, a benevolent monarch. The corrupt form would be tyranny. You could have a system with a few rulers. The good form would be an aristocracy where you'd have a few elites. The corrupt form would be an oligarchy where you'd have a kleptocratic elite. Then he also said that you could have a system where there are many rulers. The good form would be a polity where citizens rule in the interest of the community. And the corrupt form would be a democracy where citizens rule in the interest of themselves. So Aristotle said that citizens ruling in their own interests amounts to democracy. So Aristotle saw democracy as class rule by the worst class. Mob rule was basically what this was. And for this reason, democracy was viewed as the most dangerous of the corrupt forms of rule. So during this early pre-modern ancient period, even despite the influence of what was perceived or called democracy in Greece and Rome, democracy was viewed with suspicion, and citizens were viewed with suspicion. Ordinary people, as participants, were viewed with hostility and antagonism and with suspicion. Now, it wasn't really until the 18th century, in the Age of Revolution, that the concept of citizen came into vogue and became more positively associated with politics and with political outcomes. But early on in those days, democracy was not associated with elections. It was viewed with the distribution of offices by lot. The idea was these masses, these citizens, they're just going to hand out offices to each other by lot. They're going to do so in a way that is just contemptible. So Montague said, for example, suffrage by lot is natural to democracy, as that by choice is to aristocracy. Look at the contempt. Monarchy was consistently preferred to democracy. In fact, Bowden, Hobbes, Locke, Vico, Montague, Kant, and Hegel all exhibited this bias. So although we have a favorable view of citizen and democracy today, citizens were viewed very differently and weren't even associated with elections and voting relatively recently. This goes to show you that human history is relatively short, and that the period of time that we associate with our contemporary experience and understanding is actually relatively narrow. In that for a long, long time, what we consider the norm today was not the norm. Very different conceptions reigned during those periods. And one of the most important differences is this difference in the concept of the citizen. The very understanding of citizen is radically different in these early days. It wasn't until the end of the 18th century when revolution began to tear through Europe and the mainland that citizens in democracy became positively associated with outcomes in the period. Democracy versus aristocracy became the main cleavage in the Age of Revolution. That middle category was essentially eliminated. And the main distinction became one between upper and lower classes. And the Democrats, the democracy side, became positively associated with citizenship. And this is where we are today. We're in a world, we find ourselves in a world where the concept of citizen has a positive connotation, and where we first and foremost associate it with electoral democracy, with elections, with participation, with choice, with democracy. But this was not always the case. And the point for us is to see that our understanding is historical, and our types of regime and our types of political organization are historical as well. And the meaning of concept is a good example of this. So before we can continue, we get to this place where we've got to pause and consider the way the concept of citizen has changed and what rights belonged to citizens before the 18th century and which rights did not belong to citizens before the 18th century. Remember that I told you that the concept or the conceptualization of citizen is sort of hollow in the sense that we only have this notion of a citizen. The rights of that citizen can vary from moment to moment, and our expectations for that citizen can vary from moment to moment. And so before the 18th century, a very different concept of citizen prevailed. And since the 18th century, our concept of citizen has changed a great deal. And the ideals and the virtues that citizens were expected to develop have also changed considerably. And so let's step back for a moment and address some questions. These questions are designed to just sort of initiate interest in this topic and get us thinking about the evolution of this notion, this institution. The questions that I want to pose to you are, first, what rights belonged to citizens before the 18th century? Two, what ideals and virtues were citizens expected to develop? And then three, how has our notion of citizen changed since the 18th century? Jeffrey, you had your hand up.
Yeah, like it was interesting because when I was studying, when I was looking at the origins of where citizenship came from, and the actual word, which is the Greek word, polity, that actually only referred, unfortunately, only for males, males who were born in that state, whereas you had women and slaves that made up a great majority of the population as well, but they were basically not allowed. It's like even though women were also part of, if they were naturally born in that state, they were also not included or given the privileges
Yeah, and that's important, right? Because who is
that
a
male
citizen?
citizens were actually given. It's like originally,
Yeah, I'm
well,
sorry.
it's like if you're gonna ask, who's technically an actual citizen. No, no, no. Like I'm glad that you added that part in because it's like that also plays on with the idea that males were technically the only citizens of that time because they were given the privileges to be part of the elite class, and they were also given the privilege to also be part of the government, and
Yeah,
so and to also legislate.
and I would go further, Jeffrey, and I would say that it wasn't actually males, it was landowning males, because the slaves were often males too.
Right.
And what differentiated them is they didn't have land or own assets. And so, yeah, important question, right? Who actually gets to be counted as a citizen. Whenever we create an institution and we create authority to confer status or deny the conferral of status, we're constructing reality. So those of you who adhere to the constructivist perspective, this is a really resounding piece of information. A citizen is a citizen because the state says they are or are not, period. That's it. This is why we sometimes refer to state power as arbitrary, because the state can say you're a citizen or take your citizenship away. And there are actually examples of brutal, repressive, authoritarian regimes who have rescinded the citizenship of some dissidents. And it's a perfect example of how state power is used to reconstruct reality and to reconstruct the concept of a citizen. And so the concept of citizenship is one that is absolutely loaded with the power and the trappings of the modern state. In the modern state, to the extent that it constructs this concept, can also deconstruct it and take it away. And if you had any doubt, just consider and remember that who is a citizen and who is not a citizen, it varies, right? The state gets to decide who is and who is not a citizen. And so in that regard, it is absolutely political. And democracy is only one type of political regime. Now, it's one where theoretically or presumably that status of citizen is conferred on a wider and larger group of people, but there are still limits to how widely that status is conferred. And so then we have to ask questions about, well, what are the functions of citizenship? And what are the expectations for citizens? And how does our notion of citizen relate to that function that the citizen performs in the democratic state at that particular moment in time? There's a lot here, everyone, and this is a very theoretical and philosophical and normative discussion, as well as being one that's analytical and historical. And this is engaging sets of questions and issues that have often been a little bit beyond our reach in this class, but these questions are no less important. Democratic theory is a big tent, and there are analytical as well as normative and ethical questions. We still have some more time today, and I don't want to discourage anyone from commenting or speaking up if they have a point that they'd like to make. And I want to once again pose these questions to you or anyone who would like to say something about the development of the notion of citizen or the sort of political contingency of the notion of citizen. What do you think, for example, about the power of the state to take citizenship away? During the military dictatorship in Chile, a country of barely 9 million people at the time, the military dictatorship exiled 200,000 people. Think about that. That's a gigantic number. That means that they took away the citizenship of 200,000 people. Just took it away. If you had any doubt that citizenship is a political and state construct, that's a clear indication that it is.
I think
Go ahead.
I think it's pretty controversial, especially today, because if you're just taking away someone's citizenship, then you're pretty much saying that, if you don't have these certain qualities, then you're not deserving to be a part of this country, which kind of, feeds into a lot of the, I don't know, I guess I would say racism and prejudices that we have going on today. So I think once you do that, it kind of goes down kind of a rabbit hole of, dividing people in my opinion.
Absolutely. I can't imagine anything more divisive than retracting citizenship and exiling dissidents just because they oppose the repression of the regime. Of course. Efren says, for the first question, I cannot think of specific rights belonging to citizens before the 18th century. However, I do know that because democracy was not acceptable during the 18th century, freedom of expression and accountability were not visible because power belonged to the elites, without a doubt. And what I want you to see is that the age of revolution transformed that conception of citizen, partly because it introduced democracy and democracy came into vogue. The notion of citizen is intimately tied to the notion of democracy and our contemporary understanding of it. So we'll continue to explore this on Friday, everyone. And thanks for being here today. I hope that you have a good remainder of your day, and I'll see you on Friday. Thanks, Kyrie.
Hey, Professor, I kind of had a question. I just kind of wanted to see what your kind of thoughts were. You know, yesterday was a pretty historic moment in with the George Floyd case and the conviction of guilty